And oh, there we go. So our talk today is going to be about synthetic populations and agent-based modeling. So two topics that I think the group might be pretty familiar with. Certainly on the agent-based modeling side, from the synthetic populations, we'll go into what we've done at Epistemix in building our synthetic population and how that interacts with our agent-based simulation modeling language. So what we're going to show today are two different models. One is the classic shelling model. We'll show it first with NetLogo, and we'll show it within the Epistemix platform on top of our synthetic population. And then we'll also do the same with the Epstein rebellion model. And throughout the talk, you might flip back to a synthetic population and just looking at the spread of a flu epidemic, and we could do it in a couple of different cities that might be of interest to this group. So by the end of the session, what we hope to accomplish is to inspire a little bit of the use of agent-based simulation with synthetic populations. And if there are any research ideas or projects, partnerships, anything like that, that this group can help us think through, we would really appreciate it on the Epistemic side. So our agenda, we'll go into synthetic populations, we'll go into the two demos, we'll talk about sort of what we do to support people who are trying to build ABMs with our synthetic population, and then have some time for Q&A. So our whole premise at Epistemics is helping people envision paths to better futures. And one of the challenges that we identified was that in using some other modeling techniques, or where a decision maker has to understand a model, see the impact of it, sometimes just working in a NetLogo or Repast or building something from scratch in Python, sometimes it misses the mark or isn't as impactful across the board as what it could be. And so one of the things that our team started working on a bit over a decade ago was using synthetic population. We worked with RTI International on one, and we've continued to develop more ways, I should say, to add on to the synthetic population to make it more realistic. And what we found is that by creating this realistic synthetic population that you can build ABMs on top of, it enables the decision maker to more easily see the impact of models, to understand the purpose of the model, and to just see it in their own geography makes a really big difference. And so our goal when we're working with government or private industry is to enable decision makers to improve their decisions by understanding paths to different possible futures through simulation, and ultimately we can help them make better decisions to improve outcomes for people. So that's sort of what we're about, and hopefully that shows through the rest of the presentation. So one of the things that we're enabling people to do is to play out different strategies in our virtual environment, which is our synthetic population that you're able to interact with to improve outcomes based on decisions that are made. So using our synthetic population, we've had people be able to test different types of strategies, understand assumptions, do parameter sweeps, calibrate to real world existing data or observed data. And what's cool about our synthetic population is because we have an agent that represents each person in the geography that we're working in, we also are representing schools, households, and workplaces. You can look at existing data and calibrate against it within the synthetic population. So that's something that maybe in the Q&A we can dive into a little bit more as well. As I mentioned, we were doing this work for over a decade as a Center of Excellence for Modeling and Simulating of Infectious Diseases. We were funded by the NIH and the Gates Foundation. We'd also done some work with RAND, CDC, and one of our co-founders of Epistemics founded MIDAS, which from the Modeling Infectious Disease Agent study, something that I'm sure a few folks in this in the group have been exposed to. So jumping into our synthetic population. So our synthetic population, it isn't just made up data. We're pulling the data from Census, Bureau of Labor Statistics, Department of Education, American Community Survey, and we are able to enrich the synthetic population with other real world data sets. We might get some data from a group called Data Axle on workplaces, more granular for some specific areas than others. We might also get data from SafeGraph or look at Google mobility data to fine tune or calibrate mobility within a synthetic population in a specific geography over time. So we're actually taking real data and then creating agents, creating households, creating schools, creating workplaces. And what we've done with our synthetic population is not only have records of these, so you can think agents have a household assigned to them, they have a school or workplace assigned to them depending on their age. But within each of these places, there's sort of a pattern of life model behind it. So you could say this is our sociological representation of what goes on in a given geography on any daily time step for as long going forward as you'd want to run a simulation for. The cool thing about the background models that you have the dynamics behind the synthetic population, those can all be adjusted or redefined by a user. So you could imagine that the teacher to student ratio in some locations is going to be different, and there might be there might be a good reason to modify just like whatever our basic representation of that is. You might also say there are certain types of events. So whether that might be a conference or a political rally or walking around an amusement park or there's a parade going on in a given city, you can adjust contact patterns, contact rates within specific places that are event specific. All these things are able to be done because we're representing each person in the synthetic population. So from there, just to dive into what we'll start showing in our demos, we have different levels of agents. So our first level of an agent is representing a person. Let's say there's age, race, sex, household income, some basics, but what we enable other people to do is add different information about people in a couple of different ways. One way you could say, well, I have this data set and I know that this 25-year-old black male in this area likes the color blue or green or whatever it might be. Well, you can just add that as a column into the data set. You can also take survey data that you might gather and distribute that across an entire population. A couple of examples that we could talk through in the Q&A about that. The next level of agent is the administrative agent. So every school, household, workplace has an administrative agent that gets to set the time schedule. They might be able to set rules or policies that are specific to that location and the agents that show up there. And then what you get to do and what's going on in the background of the synthetic population, you have agents that interact in these places and form networks. So whether it's a physical network or a non-physical network, what I mean by that, you could think of who listens to what music or who gets their news from what news source. Those are all networks that can be formed that don't have to have a physical geography connected to it. It could just be a specific agent. You could define that to agents live in a household. They're getting their news from one location or one source or another, or they might be part of a friendship network or a specific political group, or they all might be St. Louis Cardinal baseball fans, whatever it might be. So within the synthetic population, I'll go through a quick example before handing things over to Claire. So our synthetic population of Pittsburgh, you can look at the race, gender breakdown. Each agent has a unique agent ID. You have race, age, sex, household income. This is just a snapshot of some of the data that the synthetic population has. And then we also have all of these agents represented in actual space. So I'm going to jump out of this real quick to just show a quick simulation of our Pittsburgh synthetic population in action, simulating a flu outbreak over a year's time scale. And what I'm visualizing, each point on the map is the location of where an infection happened. The different colors are breaking down who is getting infected by age. So younger than 5 to 18, 19 to 65, and older than 65. And what you're able to see and like understand through or like the dynamics of how this epidemic spreads. The other cool thing that you get to do is export all this data pretty quickly. So you can see across the entire simulation, every single agent that was exposed, infected, all the way through, and you're generating thousands, sometimes millions of rows of data based on the simulations. So it's also pretty cool to be able to zoom in to where your neighborhood might be. So folks are familiar with Pittsburgh. Here's Shenley Park. Carnegie Mellon is right over here. So you can drill down into actual neighborhoods, and going back to the envisioning paths to a better future, when you're able to show the impact of a model and things that you're simulating in actual geographies, a lot of times that helps connect what's going on with the decision maker even more. So with that, Claire, I'm going to stop sharing and pass it over to you.
Thanks, John. All right. Can everyone see that okay?
Yep.
Great. Cool. Yeah, so I'm excited to show a few examples of models that we have put together in the platform and some sort of existing comparison points in NetLogo. So as John said, we'll just jump into the shelling model first. So this is sort of the canonical implementation of housing segregation. In this case, we're going to look at Kewaunee County, Wisconsin, and the basic idea here is that agents have an innate desire to live in sort of self-similar neighborhoods. So they want their neighborhood to be at least a certain amount similar to them. The simplest version of this would be looking at two colors. Are my neighbors mostly orange, or are they mostly blue? And if the neighborhood around the agents is insufficiently similar to them, they will move to an empty location in the simulation. So in the sort of the classical NetLogo implementation, we start with a lot of orange and blue agents, as well as some empty houses, and agents really quickly settle into this totally static, highly segregated model. So what we can do with the synthetic population in the Epistemix platform is apply the principles of this model, where here you can see on the right our Fred language, so the actual coding up of the model. So we have agents that assess the color of each block group. We also have individual agents checking on the status of their block group to assess if they're happy. And so they become either happy or unhappy. And we have a condition where agents will move if they are unhappy and look for an open place to move to. And we can apply all of that to the synthetic population, the household locations. So in this case, we're using Kewaunee County, as I said, with about 8,000 households. And here you can see what that ends up looking at. So these are the starting conditions of our model. So we have each dot here is a agent living in a household, so just the householder agents in this simulation with a pre-assigned color at the start of the simulation. And what they're interested in is their block group, which are outlined here below all the dots, how similar is that to their desired color? And we can see that really quickly, with just a few time steps, we achieve that same highly segregated behavior that we see in the canonical shelling model. But now we're looking at specifically the household locations that are drawn from our synthetic population, which themselves are based on kind of realistic distributions of households, which are associated with real block groups, census tracts, all of which are built to match the the aggregate statistics for age, race, income in those areas drawn from the census. So in this really simple model, we are just using a randomly assigned orange or blue color, but we could easily start looking at the actual race characteristics of the agents, at age, income, all of these things. So there's a lot to build on here. And we can also look at that in a different way. So one of the really cool things about FRED, the ABM modeling language that the platform is based on, is that there are several hierarchies of scale with these models. So we have the individual agents, excuse me, but we also have group agents, which can sort of oversee locations or groups of agents. So that could be a household, that could be a workplace, or even a block group. So in this case, in addition to have every agent kind of printing out their information each day, which kind of produces a lot of information, as John showed, we can also just have the block group agents kind of give us a report each day on the status of their block. And so that means that we can also run these kind of simulations for much larger locations with hundreds of thousands of agents and get out usable, workable information on the scales that we're interested in. So this is just the average color of the fraction that's red or blue, orange or blue in that block group. So that is our shelling model. Do folks have any questions on that? Cool. Then I will jump into the rebelling model, which is another sort of canonical model, agent-based model. So this is this idea that in a world where agents are dissatisfied with the government, they are looking to rebel against it. What stops them from rebelling is the presence of cops who will try to jail agents who are openly rebelling, but agents kind of become emboldened if there are a larger number of agents who are rebelling around them. So in this classic grid implementation, oops, what have I? Let me make sure this actually, agents will go through phases of high rebellion, followed by being jailed, and then a quick spike of rebellion as sort of you get these emergent dynamics that come out of the model. It's a fun one to play around with and test out the parameter space. And we have this model built in the platform in this kind of classic grid method as well. So here is our grid implementation of the rebellion model. So up top, we have our sort of summary of how many agents each day are either passive, so they are not rebelling, actively rebelling in red, or have been jailed by a cop agent. And you can see how we get these very chaotic spikes in behavior as sort of, and this is all looking at different local dynamics. So this is kind of the summary of all agents in the simulation. There are 1,600. And then here is them spatially, and you can see that we get these waves of rebellion. But sort of interestingly, we also get pockets of local rebellion activity. So even if overall the average, like on average, agents are not rebelling, you might get isolated areas where there is more rebellion in action. And so these are these emergent spatial dynamics going on here. But what's really cool, I think, is that we can take this and now apply these same principles to our synthetic population with its sort of realistic geolocations. So I should have shown this model. So here I'm showing again the code on the right kind of relies on 3 fundamental loops. So agents that are regular agents will kind of get their key characteristics. So how risk averse they are, what their perceived hardship is, so how frustrated they are kind of as a baseline, and then start out at a random location. They look around their local neighborhood to see kind of if conditions are good for rebellion, and then move either into a passive or rebellion state as they move through the simulation. Meanwhile, the cop agents will get set up, move somewhere, and look for an agent who is rebelling to make an arrest. So they have those 2 loops. And then you have kind of the places themselves, which are assessing, okay, like if I'm living here, kind of what's the sort of landscape around me. And what I think is really cool is we can now apply this exactly the same code with no changes, but now agents are moving to real locations in a real place, in this case, Grand Isle County, Vermont, which is right south of Montreal. And here is what that looks like, where we have these waves of rebelling agents at the start. The blue cop agents kind of work to jail the dissident agents. In this case, we have a cessation of behavior for a while, but we start getting these pockets of rebellion moving through the space. And so these are based on kind of our real approximations of the households in this area. In this case, we have agents kind of doing that same moving each time step behavior, moving from household to household, but we could easily start extending this by using the built-in more realistic agent schedules that we have in the synthetic population. So every agent starts with a household, they have a workplace or a school, depending on their age, and they move to these locations at appropriate times of day. They also interact with their block group and their census tract. So we have these kind of mixing groups. These were originally set up for the epidemiological side of things, but they have a lot of other utility. So you could imagine having agents move through their daily schedules and having kind of cops choose to move to large areas where folks are, if folks are kind of in a working district versus at home at night, and then start building out, both having agents, say, basing their personal grievance levels on their own characteristics, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of exciting ways that we could start extending these models. We could start using the social networks, so looking at both their physical networks from their workplaces, their households, as well as kind of layering on top an additional social network and seeing what fraction of their close contacts are in rebellion, and use that as a factor for assessing whether an agent makes the jump to rebellion. So there are a lot of ways that we could start expanding and kind of adding more realism and more dynamics to these models. John, do you want me to show influenza with mitigations as well, or do you want to jump back on?
Let's just pause real quick and see if anyone has
that was a lot of talking.
on...
Sorry.
All good. No, it was amazing. So, I guess our goal is to see what sort of questions this led to, knowing that we can take some of the classic social dynamics models and start porting them from a NetLogo or others into a more realistic geography. Like I said, are there questions from the group on how to do that, or any ideas if this comes up before we transition to the next section?
Hey, a fun thing is that you'll note if you look at the people list, the guy labeled Josh is in fact Josh Epstein. Hi, Josh.
Oh my God.
He's here.
Hi. Oh no, great job, really, everything.
Thank you so much.
I have one question on the.
Good.
I'm sorry. Was that an invitation to say something, Tim?
It was just, if you wanted to, I figured I'd make the introduction, since it's not common that you present an iconic model and you actually have the guy who wrote it sitting there.
Well,
and also you do a good job of presenting it. I don't think you hate to say something foolish, but I don't think you did.
No.
Well.
I mean, if I don't want to interrupt other people. I think it's all great. I mean, I really am very impressed by all the work, and the presentation is terrific. And I can easily see how this could be extended in a million ways. And I think it's just an incredibly promising technology. And I will follow up, and we can talk about, mutual interests. But I thought on the epi part, I am wondering, how are you, I know you are planning to do this, but I'm wondering, how are you doing behavioral adaptation in these epidemics? Mm-hmm. I mean, do people, I'm very interested in this whole issue of behavioral drivers of epidemic dynamics. And if people are scared of the bug, then they can go into hiding, but that depresses the growth rate of the bug, and then they're not scared anymore and they come out prematurely and you get a second wave. Mm-hmm. These things like this. I mean, are you toying around with ideas about how to get behavioral adaptation into these models?
Josh, totally. And I know that your conversations with Don Burke on the, on this exact topic, it's what we're certainly getting into. So,
great.
Claire, do you want to jump to the Well, actually,
Yeah,
there's
well,
one
I can,
question.
yeah, there were a
Um,
few other questions. Can we put a pin in Epidemics and we'll jump to that in a
Sure,
second if
sure.
folks wanted to touch on anything that I just showed. I think I saw Andrew with a hand up.
Thanks. I appreciate it. All this looks super, super cool. My question was, because you pose this as like, high fidelity views, and if I'm sort of separating out model from view here, like high fidelity view is a great engagement device for people who didn't build the model. And as your introductory material here, you've presented these like exciting, fun, like canonical simple models. And I wonder if maybe you can comment on the sort of what happens when you get this mismatch of a low fidelity model with a high fidelity view, and what that does, since you've premised this as like, this is our engagement device, we want it to look realistic, but under the hood, there's different things going on.
Yeah, absolutely. So if I think I'm understanding you right, so here we're showing toy models effectively, but we're also working to build increasing more complex models. So our COVID model, for instance, has multiple strains. There's a vaccine module, there's a vaccine hesitancy module, things like that. So we're trying to build up the complexity of the models. And then there's the synthetic population itself, which exists at a certain level of specificity, which can be, I would say, added to or subtracted from as needed to match the level of interest of the behavior that we're trying to capture. Is that speaking to?
No, it certainly is. It just, I always think about this particular issue of like how the fidelity of the model view can signal, whether we mean it to or not, the fidelity of the underlying model, and wonder if because you guys are at the sort of frontier in this area, like maybe you're thinking about best practices for what we're communicating about the underlying model via the sophisticated view.
Absolutely. So certainly in this case, I'm showing you a single run from each of these simulations. When we are producing something like a dashboard, we are doing many, many runs. So we're trying to capture the fact that we are giving a prediction of dynamics rather than an absolute quantitative assessment of behaviors. I think that's really important, and we're working on better ways to build up our, calibration tools to actually be validating against real data when we get into these kind of choices of agent behaviors, that sort of thing. So I think it's an ongoing project to find the right way to get people excited about the ways that we can learn kind of about dynamics and emergent behaviors without presenting this as a magic 8-ball that returns a precise answer about what the future holds.
Perfect. Thank you. It's really exciting.
Thank you. Jacob, I saw a hand.
Yeah, thanks. This is very cool stuff. I'm wondering about the scaling of the synthetic population and the environment. So do you have is it one-to-one in terms of the digital agents and the cities that you're modeling?
That's right.
So you're always doing one-to-one?
Yeah, so for the synthetic population itself, we have the full US. We usually run in counties at a time, but for larger simulations, we'll run like full metro areas, like for the COVID model, that sort of thing. I've done some work with like small scale, so using placeholder agents. So the rebellion grid model is of course not synthetic agents. This is just kind of pre-generated agents. So you can use the synthetic population as is. You could also like load that, like take a like 10% sample or something, and then reload that in and work on a smaller segment of the population, or just kind of drop down in like a smaller geospatial segment.
Cool. So yes, I'm wondering, so part of the reason I'm asking this question, there's people in the lab that I'm in that are doing epidemiology models of the Chicago area. And because like 3 million agents is really computationally expensive, they're doing 1-to-10 ratio modeling 300,000 agents. I haven't thought about this until just now, but like if you scale down the population, but you're keeping the geospatial stuff the same, you could have mismatches there where like, you're basically modeling a less dense population if you do something like that. So yeah, I'm curious if what you've done around issues like that, or if you're always just doing one-to-one, then maybe that's not an issue.
Yeah, pretty much we're doing one-to-one, and for our epidemiology models, we're running on like AWS, so we are just sort of taking the time to do the full compute. But that's a really interesting question of like how you would account for spatial dynamics. I think if you tried to, so for us, what kind of matters is the mixing groups themselves. So you have like for our epidemiology models, you have the households, workplaces, schools, and then the mixing groups of block group, census tract, county. So I think you would want to, as long as you scaled the contact rate properly, I don't know, that's a really interesting question. It would be fun to explore more.
Yeah, Claire, I'll take, so Jacob,
Consistently,
just ran like our simple epidemic model on like all of Chicago, or well, Chicago, so it's gonna be Cook County, Illinois. So I'll pull that up. It'll, right now, if it's running on my local machine, probably takes 4 to 5 minutes. So some of the things that we've built in within the synthetic population and for like, some models that we know that people are gonna run often, are some things that make it more computationally efficient to run. And then like the other part of what Claire was getting at is for either really complex models in a smaller geography or models that do require a lot of compute. What we've done is made it so like, if you have the resource or want to run this locally, you can do it. It's just it might take longer, but we have like synced up everything on AWS. Others have synced up our platform on Azure, if they're a Microsoft oriented company, so that you can run large populations with complex models at scale. So that's something that we've
and the models are very parallelizable, so it is relatively easy to just like, if you have a machine with more cores, to apply it, to just like set up a model and let it go, which is really helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I can, so just since we've been on the topic of epidemics so much, I could just show, I think John's maybe going to show a few other things, but this is just looking at our sort of simple flu. So using an SCIR model applied to the synthetic population for, again, this Kewaunee County in Wisconsin, which I've been using it as example. So this is a typical, like a simple flu outbreak over the course of 3 months, starting with 10 agents randomly selected to be exposed. In this case, we have that 2/3 of agents become symptomatic, 1/3 become asymptomatic. And then once they've recovered, they're just recovered, and just sort of let that go in this model. So in this these curves here, we have blue is exposed, red is infectious and asymptomatic, green are symptomatic, and then purple is recovered. So we have kind of this peak a month in to the beginning of the flu, and then sort of slowly tailing off over the next 2 months. But I think one of the really cool things about what our platform enables is really tracking where exactly these pandemics or epidemics are growing, where they're taking root. So what I'm showing here is a map of the county with each dot is a location where exposures occurred. So in green, we have households. In pink, we have workplaces, and in purple, we have schools, and they're all scaled by the number of exposures that occurred in these locations in the model. And what you can see is that, in fact, like, even though we're just modeling Kewaunee County, there's a ton of exposure happening over here in Green Bay, because a lot of folks in the synthetic population commute to work in Green Bay, and so then they're exposing their office mates here and bringing that back home, and so that's a large site of transmission. We have just a few schools in this county, but they have a huge number of exposures. It's because, of course, children are very susceptible and packed together. So these kind of becomes ways that we can start breaking down and getting, again, this feel for the dynamics of, in this case, the epidemic. And since we were sort of talking about what behaviors look like, there are quite a few ways that one could apply different behaviors, in this case, in response to a pandemic. So we could build in agent rules. So agents maybe are vaccine hesitant already if they have a network where a large number of their close contacts are vaccine hesitant, that might make them even more hesitant. We also, that's sort of individualistic behaviors that we could look at, but we also have the ability to set simulation level or group level rules. So we could have workplaces impose policies that say, if you're sick, please don't come into work. So a stay-at-home policy. So what I want to also show is just starting to look at these like scenarios, comparisons. So in this case, we created 2 stay-home policies. One where every agent is encouraged to stay home from work or school if they start showing symptoms, and they do that about a 95% rate. And then a second variant where agents are much more likely to stay home from work or school if their household has a higher income. So if they feel able to take the time off, they're more likely to stay home when they're sick. And what we can see is that the stay home all does reduce the curve somewhat. The stay home income base reduces the curve a little bit, but not that significantly, sort of for 2 major reasons. So here we have the locations where exposures are occurring, just focusing on household, school, and workplace. And household is unchanged across the policies. School and workplace are reduced in this orange stay home all, but not entirely, because of course 1/3 of cases are asymptomatic. So folks just don't realize that they're spreading the disease. And I think more interestingly, if you start applying this kind of income base, so the expectation that agents with lower incomes are going to feel pressure to go to work just because they don't have access to sick days, they have a more precarious financial situation, you are going to slightly reduce the curve, but you still have a lot of work left to do. So sort of other policies might be needed to fill in these gaps if you're really looking to reduce the spread of this disease. So yeah, happy to chat more about any of this, about any other models, but also happy to turn it over to John and also just talk more offline or after this about what we're working on.
If I can say, I think that's great, and it lets you get your teeth into the whole connection between wealth disparities and health disparities in a setting like COVID, but in many other settings. So I think that's a very nice move too.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, building on that for a second, a study that I really wanted to do and almost was able to do at RAND was to get, actually, I got the data, mobile phone location data for Portland, and built a network that was very interesting based on who came within 10 meters of whom before and after lockdown. Got the same data for Detroit and wasn't actually able to get the money to analyze it. But a fascinating thing about Detroit is it's so segregated by race that if you know where someone lives, you know with like 98% probability what their race is. And in Detroit, Black people had COVID a lot more than white people early in the pandemic. And there were lots of reasons proposed for that maybe it's because of adaptations to malaria, maybe it's because of cultural differences, hugging and touching. And it seemed pretty clear that the problem was that in Detroit, Black people are much more likely to have in-person jobs that they can't do remotely.
Yeah.
And so running this, just exactly what you got here for Detroit, it would be very interesting to see whether you could reproduce the outcome disparities that we saw in Detroit. I think you've pretty much done it already.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of like the big reasons why using the synthetic population, you can even start to see that even with a simple model, which is pretty cool. Claire, if I could jump to share screen again.
And I think while John's setting that up, I'll say, certainly you could start looking at like, okay, I have a theory about staying home from work versus vaccine hesitancy, and you could build both of those. You could test baseline each of those scenarios independently and then together and see like if you're capturing the right both spatial and kind of aggregate dynamics for a system like that.
So Jake, within the time it took for you to say Chicago as a question, just ran like the same flu model that I did for Pittsburgh with Chicago. And so like we can drill down and go neighborhood by neighborhood across the whole city. The other cool thing with like choosing to do this for Chicago agents from Chicago. They still travel for work within this simulation. And so what you'll see is like the points that are lighting up in locations that are not in Cook County, there's still an agent who has a household that is in Cook County, but they're elsewhere. And that's based off of the work-oriented data and intercity travel data that we have. So, so yeah, like this was one run of the simulation. You know, of course, you might want to run many, and then you could look at different simulations at the same time step, see if the spatial distribution is different, look for different patterns there. So yeah, all those things are a go. And I think what Claire was getting at, being able to just test the different hypotheses, even before you get like the mobile like data set or whatever it might be, because the synthetic population there enables you to start looking at those types of questions. So yeah, only other things that that I'll kind of end on, just jumping back to the slides. One of the big reasons why we feel that like we made a lot of effort in creating this Fred modeling language was to make modeling I guess more accessible, I guess decrease the barrier to entry for new people who are trying to model complex behaviors. And the goals there was to kind of move from this place of, all right, we need to have some standardizations around like, all right, needs to run in the cloud to get the computational efficiency. We want to be able to like kind of move up this kind of inverted value triangle where models are actually able to like be presented to decision makers so that they can impact decisions. And what we're hoping to make happen is be able to, with the Fred modeling language, connect multiple disciplines together, because you have the synthetic population, it exists as kind of the same data set that people are using. And then using the modeling language, it creates a common way for people to have a dialogue around assumptions, adding additional data to models, and focusing on these three kind of middle areas. And this was something that the Open Geospatial group was talking about a lot over the last week, going from models to analysis ready data, and then how do you begin connecting the social dynamics with economic dynamics, or the social dynamics with environmental impacts that different things might have. So to conclude, before we jump into more Q&A, just like a quick note on synthetic populations and the Fred modeling language, which we are making openly available. So the synthetic populations, like one cool thing about it is the data set can be the same for everyone's models. Like it's already there, it exists. You can just start focusing on building models on top of it. And the final bullet here is, because you have that data set there, like you can begin shifting the focus rather from like data wrangling, make sure it's all there, but focusing on the actual social dynamics and social behavioral dynamics of what you're modeling. The other thing, the Fred modeling language, which we're making openly available, is the idea where we're able to simulate like health disease dynamics with the policy dynamics with individual behaviors, and also connect that into other areas. So we had one group, they're very econometric model focused. They've been able to take those models, rewrite them in the Fred modeling language to build ABMs to understand the emergent phenomena that their econometric models weren't able to capture. And the other thing around having a shared or open modeling language that in our different domains and disciplines, we can all use the same thing, is it provides better alignment with decision makers. So, decision maker, whether that be a policymaker at a local county or within a governor's office or at the federal level, having the shared language enables modelers to communicate with decision makers more easily. That's our hope for what we're doing. So with that, I will stop sharing and kind of open it up for any questions in the last 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, John, Claire. Any questions? Hear some sound from someone. Oh, yeah.
Well, Will, to give you a chance to jump on, I don't know if you want to talk about how we can get people access, and if they want to try out the platform, from in our support perspective, very similar to what we presented a couple weeks ago with the group at MITRE. But yeah, I'll let you take it away to wrap up.
Jacob,
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
sorry, Jacob has a question.
Yeah, let's do that.
This is probably related to what you're going to talk about, so maybe you can just fold it in. I'm curious on the sort of education and barrier to entry side. So I'm in the group that puts out NetLogo, and so there's a big focus on education, but there is also an attempt to make it high ceiling, as a low threshold, high ceiling. This platform, I think, at least at the by default out of the box, is higher threshold. Like there's more stuff you can do with it. But I'm curious if you could talk about how low the threshold do you think it is? Like if you were teaching an intro agent-based modeling course, would you use this, or would you still use something like NetLogo? Like how much programming experience do you think people need to be able to use the platform? If they're trying to like customize the social interactions, how much programming experience do they need? Those types of things.
Yeah, ideally it's less and less over time. So we've done a couple courses in a graduate school of public health where the program experience was none to a lot. And by the end of a semester, everybody was able to write their own model. And it was a new model from scratch that included like their monkeypox model that included behaviors, different location dynamics going on. So right now, I'd say somebody with, if somebody can write an ABM in Python, like they'll be able to write in the Fred modeling language, no question. What we're building towards is having these component parts of models that are templates that people can use. So if there's like a different type of social contagion, they can start with a template, adjust some parameters as needed, and then because each of the models will have modules, you can begin connecting them to build up to a larger model. So we're trying to make it easier and easier over time. Claire, you're really close to this, so I don't know if you have other thoughts on barrier to entry here.
Yeah, I think we've worked hard to like have, basically what I've shown you are sort of the types of like introductory models to give folks an idea of the sort of what they could do with Fred. And then we have a whole quick start guide, which is like 10 or 11 pretty in-depth lessons that really walk you through like the true nuts and bolts of building up like the models themselves, agent behaviors, interacting with places, getting out useful information, looking at that in Python. But ultimately, you do need at least some facility with a programming language, ideally Python, because we're working in a Python IDE. So the expectation is that like you're pulling out data and then you want to like assess and look at that data. And while we want to build up the tools to make that easier for folks, that's definitely a huge project. And that's further down the line. But I do think someone with just a little bit of facility with programming can get started. When it comes to like start building more sophisticated behaviors, it's definitely like that's a bigger project. And it's something that we hope to continue to make easier. But I would say if you really want to start like kit bashing things together, some comfort with programming is definitely going to be needed.
Thank you. Nick Miller. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, can I ask, I'm wondering if you guys are building any tools related to like model validation. So obviously like big part of the synthetic populations is accessing and aggregating lots of data. And if you're doing anything similar using related data to validate models or to help people validate their models.
Yeah, Claire or Andrew, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk. Hi, Nick. So yeah, so I interpret validation to be evaluating that a particular model is suitable for a particular purpose. So the number of ways in which you can validate a model is as many there are as many as there are models that you could possibly make, right? So one of the things that we are working towards is more standardized tools for doing things like sensitivity analysis. So, you know, you wouldn't have to write your own software tools to be able to bootstrap a process like that. But we have lots of examples of how we have validated our own models. So the big one was the COVID-19 model that we used during the previous 2 years. So, you know, we were comparing outputs of simulation data to observed cases, hospitalizations, and deaths from around the United States on a regular basis. So we developed a pretty slick automated procedure for how we were doing that over time. But I think that your question hints at a good suggestion for something to work on, which is how to standardize that and document how people can approach that procedure to help standardize the way that they do that with their own models.
Great, thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, I think that's it. I think William wanted to continue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks. So yeah, so in terms of next steps, so I mean, we are fairly early in our journey of just making this platform high quality and more accessible. And so our hope is that we would want all of you to be able to easily model and succeed at the platform, and also give us feedback on improving it. So in terms of next steps, I don't know if I can get everyone's email on this, but we will share out a way to sign up for the platform. We also have a quick start guide to get you started building models once you get into the IDE. So 30-day trial for everyone. And we're actually setting up an academic user track as well. So we'll be able to, you know, continue giving people with EDU email addresses access to our synthetic population to build out their models. And then also we'll follow up with some support resources. But effectively right now, as we're building out, we want to be high touch and make sure that our early users are successful. And so we'll have, you know, individualized resources to connect with any of you around building models.
There is a question in chat. Is Epistemix a paid platform for academic use?
So we're making, for any academic user, they get access to the synthetic population, and we can't, like, if you're running it locally, like with your own compute resources, yes, like completely free. But if you're wanting to run on like our AWS instances, that is something that we have a partnership with AWS that we can work with you to have them possibly cover the cost on. But you know, that's a case-by-case basis, and you know, AWS is a partner in making that decision. So ideally we'd make it all free, but that would be the only thing that academic users would have to pay for over time.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay.
All right. Well, thank you again for having us on. I really appreciate it. And if there's anyone that wants to follow up, you know, we're here, glad to get additional feedback. And if there's other models you think might be interesting to see on the synthetic population, let us know. Glad to work on it with you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you. Very good.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Yeah.